God's acceptance. We're reading this chapter, this subsection here under the chapter of destiny. Let's take a look at the contents. So we were talking about qadar, destiny. That's broad topic here. We are talking about that. From there we went to talk about the taqdir and the maqdur. And there we mentioned the hadith of Jibreel. Wal-qadar khayrihi wa sharrihi. And we did have to talk about God's acceptance when it came to explaining the maqdur and the taqdir, really. But the chapter there is not about acceptance. It's about taqdir and maqdur. If you need a reminder of what that means, you can ask if you want, or you can review. Then from there, we talked about good and evil. This is the outstanding reference. The outstanding reference is a book that I've compiled from the books of Sheikh Abdullah, mostly in Aqidah. And then I put the information arranged. And then anything else I had, any other references and sources that I had that were relevant, I put them in here. And then from there, we talked about God's command in reference to what he willed. His command in the context of destining. And now we want to talk about his acceptance before we talk about pending destiny, and then talk about the qadariyah, the deniers of qadar. Then that's going to be the end of the first volume in the outstanding reference. It says here, the outstanding reference, volumes 1 through 3. So we're here, God's acceptance. The author says, there is no correlation between God's will and God's rida, acceptance. They're not the same. Those are not two names for the same attribute. Meaning that Allah did indeed will what he does not accept. That's the creed of Ahlus Sunnah. If it were said, is his will accepted or not? We say, indeed it is. So that answers the question. Indeed it is, period, that's it. Then if they say, so that means that's the end of the answer. So when someone asks you a question, answer his question and then stop. So if it were said, is his will accepted or not? We say, indeed it is. If they say, why then does he punish for what he accepts? We say, in fact, he punishes for what he does not accept. So that question right there is khalt, means mixing things up. Why is he punished for what he accepts? Is his will accepted? He expects us to say yes. So then we're going to say what he expected. Yes. Then he says, why then does he punish for what he accepts? And this question right here is mixed up, is jumbled. So we're going to answer by unjumbling it. In fact, he punishes for what he does not accept. His will, preordainment, and all of his attributes are accepted. But the deed of the slave that happens by the will could be acceptable or not, because it might be evil. The deed of the slave might be evil and happens by God's will. Or it might be a good deed. So if it's good, it's acceptable. The willed thing, if it's good, it's acceptable. And if it's not, then it's not. The deed of the slave that happens by the will could be acceptable or not. If not, then he punishes for it. Al-Jubai argued by the saying of Allah. What's his argument? His argument is that God's acceptance is God's will. And he argued by an ayah of the Quran for this mistake, that Allah said, وَلَا يَرْضَى لِعِبَادِهِ الْكُفْرِ. He does not accept blasphemy for his slaves. So according to Al-Jubba'i, that means he does not will for blasphemy from his slaves. So he's using this ayah to prove that Allah does not will for blasphemy. He said, had blasphemy been by the decree, that's God's attribute, it would be obligatory on us to accept it, because accepting the decree is obligatory. So that's muddled. He said, and since the nation agreed that accepting blasphemy is blasphemy, it is obligatory to say that it is not by the decree, nor is it by his acceptance. They likewise said, yani, the Mu'tazila, that Allah said, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I did not create the genies and humans except to worship me, but for them to worship me. So they cite this ayah also to prove their mistake. They say that Allah informed that he created the humans and genies for worship. So whoever says that he created the blasphemer for blasphemy and the sinner for sins has rejected the judgment of the texts. So inshallah, that argument is clear there. So then we need to answer it. The scholars responded, firstly, blasphemy is not the decree itself. That's why we have a capital D here. It's the attribute of Allah, this decree. So the blasphemy is not the decree itself. It is what is related to the decree, meaning it is the decreed amongst the decreed. The obligation is to love the decree, which is the attribute, not the decreed necessarily, meaning not necessarily in all cases we're obligated to love the decreed. We don't love the decreed thing because it is decreed, unless it is among what is accepted by Allah. Then we will love it. And it's something that's obligatory to love, whether people or deeds. Then we love it. We're obligated to. As for the argument that he based on the verse, it can be answered in several ways. Yani, he here means Al-Jubba'i. So let's see what happened here. In the attempt to compact all this information. So we started by differentiating between irada, will of God, and rida, acceptance of God. And rida of Allah means mahabbatullah, the mahabba. So someone started with this question here, which they mean by it something fallacious. It's not, yani what they mean by what they're asking is not what we mean by their words. They're saying words that mean something else to us or mean something else to them. They said, is his will accepted or not? So we're going to say, according to what will means, according to us, according to what will means to us, we're going to say, indeed, it is accepted. So then he proceeds, building on what it means to him. Why then does he punish for what he accepts? Because accepts here to him means wills. So we say, in fact, he punishes for what he does not accept. Okay, that's clear. Then we presented Jubba'i's using an ayah to prove a mistake and his argument. And the Mu'tazila had a similar argument to that. So we here just put it with this one so we can answer all of it. They likewise said, cited this ayah, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I did not create the genies and humans but for them to worship me. So they're using this ayah like how Al-Jubba'i used this ayah. وَلَا يَرْضَى لِعِبَادِهِ الْكُفْرِ. He does not accept blasphemy for his slaves. So the scholars responded with an answer that answers all of that. Those two ayahs right there, they have the same idea. So here's an answer for all of that. But do we have an answer to address the ayah that Al-Jubai produced in particular? Yes. As for the argument that he based on this verse, the first verse. So let's say the first verse. It can be answered in several ways, but we don't need the word first here because we said he is Al-Jubai. So really it's clear even without the word first. As long as you're following well and you're not doubting your own intelligence. It can be answered in several ways, what Al-Jubai said concerning that ayah. One, willing is not accepting. That's what we said already. Allah willed for blasphemy but does not accept it, because acceptance is an expression of praise. Acceptance is to consider something good and to approve of it. So that means, according to this, then you have no evidence in this ayah, O Jubai. For example, Allah said, لَقَدْ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Allah accepted the believers. This means that they are praiseworthy. This is different from will. For the will of God is the specifier of one of two possibilities. A person would do many things by his will and choice without accepting them. And even for a slave, will is not acceptance. This is the difference between them. So first answer is that will is not acceptance, or acceptance is not will, yani. Let's change the words here. Let's say it like this. Acceptance is not will. Here's another answer. If acceptance is the will, yani, for argument's sake, if we were to suppose that in this ayah, وَلَا يَرْضَى لِعِبَادِهِ الْكُفْرِ, he does not accept blasphemy for his slaves, that acceptance here does mean will, for argument's sake, then to say he does not accept blasphemy for his slaves means he does not will it for him. So if that is the way to interpret it, then his slaves here, quote unquote, slaves in this verse are his believing slaves in particular. He does not will blasphemy for his believing slaves. So, okay. So what would Mu'tazili say here? You could expect, that is, what might you expect him to say? You might expect him to say, it's not restricted this way though. It just says his slaves. How can you limit it to his believing slaves? Then the answer is, like how the expression ibad, slaves, was used specifically for the believers in many places in the Quran. This would just be one of them. This would be one among them. If we want, for argument's sake, to say that accepting is willing, then his willing the blasphemy for his disbelieving slave would still be covered by other verses, like وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا أَن يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ. You do not will but what Allah wills, Lord of the worlds. We have some footnotes here. Okay, so we have a footnote here. If the will is the acceptance, irada did indeed come in some spots meaning mahabbah, which means for Allah acceptance. Like when Allah said, يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرَ وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرَ. Allah wants, so I usually don't translate as loves here, prefers the ease for you and does not want the difficult for you. So that's not, nothing here refers to an emotion. Nothing here refers to an attribute of emotion for Allah Ta'ala. So we said right here, will irada, it did come with the meaning of mahabba in some spots. But what's the ayah we talking about here? Talk about an ayah that doesn't mention will. The ayah mentions rida, acceptance. وَلَا يَرْضَى لِعِبَادِهِ الْكُفُرِ. He doesn't accept blasphemy for his slaves. So the footnote we're reading right now does not mean that rida came with the meaning of irada, because you might reverse what was said there. We're talking about the exact words that came in the religious text. Then what the footnote is saying is that irada came with the meaning of rida or mahabba, which means rida. So will did indeed come in some spots meaning mahabba, which for Allah means acceptance. Like when Allah said, يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرَ وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرَ. I'm going to relieve myself here. Allah wants, i.e., accepts the ease for you. That means He reveals easy laws for you. He sanctions easy laws for you. وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرَ. And He does not want the difficult for you, means He does not sanction for you difficult laws. So the irada here means acceptance. This is because Allah did not obligate anything in the religion that is beyond the ability of the slave. And we have another footnote here. So here it says, like how the expression ibad was used specifically for the believers in many places in the Quran. Footnote, Allah said, وَعِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا. The slaves of Ar-Rahman who walk on the earth humbly. Or let's just say walk the earth. Who walk the earth humbly. So this is believing slaves here. He also said, إِنَّ عِبَادِي لَيْسَ لَكَ عَلَيْهِمْ سُلْطَانٌ. You surely have no dominion over my slaves, O Satan. My slaves here means the saints in particular, actually, for this ayah. وَسُبْحَانَ اللَّهِ وَبِحَمْدِهِ.